When I moved to Milwaukee, I was studying at the University of Milwaukee and living in the dorms, and it was quite a different life than living in the woods on the reservation, because where I grew up I couldn't even see a neighbor. I was just surrounded by trees, and the river was across the road, and could walk for miles and miles and not see any people in the woods. So I came, and it was like a different type of woods, a lot more wild, I guess, with people everywhere.
As American Indian people, we do live in two worlds. The one world is maintaining our traditions and our cultures and passing those traditions down to our children and to our families, while also maintaining and living in contemporary society.
In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, members of various Indian nations live out their daily lives through the historical practices of collective action. They are a diverse group. Some urban Indians migrate back and forth between Milwaukee and the reservations or settlements of their own nations, while others live exclusively in the city. The largest number of Milwaukee Indians today come from the Ojibwa, Oneida, Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, and Stockbridge-Munsee nations. Most of these nations were also those that had settled in southeastern Wisconsin and the area that would later be known as Milwaukee before the Europeans arrived. But several hundred years of European encroachment on the land and treaties broken by the American government resulted in the removal of these nations to reserved parcels of land far away from the Milwaukee area. What brought them back? To answer that question, one must look at the combined push-pull factors that the indigenous Wisconsin population faced. As Milwaukee developed into a European-styled city, some native people routinely traveled to Milwaukee for trading and employment opportunities. But the United States government that had initially maneuvered the Wisconsin Indians onto reservations gradually reversed its policies. Some agencies began to express written concerns that the native population had not assimilated to the wider U.S. society. The goals then became the disintegration of the settlement communities, or as some flatly stated, the de-Indianizing of the indigenous people. One implemented policy was the boarding school, where between 1870 and well into the 20th century, Indian children were taken from their families and taught the customs of white rural settlers. Some Wisconsin Indians began to leave the reservations to avoid personal and cultural loss of their children.
My grandmother, when she was younger, was taken off the reservation and became known as one of the boarding school children, where they used to take the young American Indian children off the reservations and put them into boarding schools and assimilate their way of life by not letting them speak their language and not letting them practice their ceremonies. And because my grandmother had been one of these boarding school children, when her children got a little older, her and my grandfather moved off the reservation and came to the urban areas because my grandmother had that fear of that same thing happening to her children.
In the middle of the 20th century, the U.S. government instituted two new policies, both again designed to de-Indianize the native population. One policy was introduced to terminate the reservations, and the second policy, called the Voluntary Relocation Program, was designed to move Indians off the reservations and into the cities.
Termination was a government policy where they experimented on terminating the reservation status of 6 tribes throughout the country. And one of the 6 tribes was the Menominee Nation up in northern Wisconsin. And the termination policy actually terminated their status, put them under state control where they became, I believe, a county. And it was more destructive than it was helpful, and it was very, very rough on the Menominee people, and it nearly wiped them out as a tribal entity.
Relocation was a policy that had the government had implemented that took natives from the reservations and transplanted them into the cities to try and assimilate them and make them be more like mainstream society, and to cut them off from the reservation, the language, the culture, they would become more assimilated. So they transplanted them here a long time ago, and Milwaukee was one of those big cities that they did that with. And as a result, there's these people who have been dislocated from their reservations for a while, for quite a while, and then they had children, and their children had children, and that's how really the communities and the cities evolved.
The government would set up little relocation offices here in Minneapolis and Chicago and LA and Denver and all those places. There'd be little relocation centers. So they'd bring these families here, and then they'd drop them in the middle of the cities and leave them on their own.
When the native people arrived in Milwaukee from the rural settlements, few had the needed skills or support systems to thrive in an urban environment. Oftentimes, local taverns served as the only community gathering places.
The only place you could see relatives or talk to relatives is the Indian bars. Yeah. That's where you could ask us who's so-and-so here, and that's the only gathering place was the Indian bars in those days. And some of the people had their address to their bar. They get their meal in the bars, in the taverns. A lot of them done that.
Furthermore, the urban migrants often lost access to the educational, health, and social service benefits they had negotiated on the reservations. Most of these government-sponsored benefits were restricted to those on reservations, and then only to Native people with at least 1/4 blood quantum of that nation. Many of the urban Indians no longer held residency on their reservations, and many had also intermarried with Europeans or with members of other Indian nations and could not meet the blood quantum requirement.
Urban areas are areas where at least half of the population of American Indians in America today live, yet it's where the benefits aren't, and it's also where the largest number of Indians who, although Indian by descendancy, live but aren't eligible to go any place to get benefits. So the greatest need exists in urban Indian communities, and that's where the dearth of resources are from the federal government that emanate from those early agreements between recognized tribes and the federal government.
It would be at this point in history that Indians in the city began to tighten their networks. An urban Indian culture was emerging in Milwaukee. The urban Indian culture would develop through two interrelated processes: recognizing connections and acting collectively. Wisconsin Indian scholar Nancy Lurie described the process well from her book. As the threat of termination faded by the mid-1960s, the relocation policy of the 1950s continued to have far-reaching consequences. In much the same way that boarding schools had inadvertently stimulated early pan-Indian sentiments and activities, relocation stimulated cooperation in the cities among people from many tribes and promoted a broad sense of concern for any Indians wherever they might live. The urban experience tended to reinforce Indian identity and values rather than dissipating them, as was intended by proponents of relocation. In the city, Indians from various nations would have more opportunities to communicate with diverse populations. Anthropologists and Native scholars have long pointed out the ways that American Indians experience connections, how Indian ways focus on the harmony among relationships rather than the distinctions.
Every day we acknowledge our Creator. Every morning when we say our prayers, we acknowledge our grandmothers who are in the moon, and our grandfathers and brothers and sisters who are part of this earth. And so we stay connected that way by honoring all of our relatives every morning and throughout the whole day.
There's a support system of uncles and aunts and cousins that are there. And I don't think that especially is unique to Native people, but it is unique to folks that come from a village life. And I think we've still retained that in the city.
We are all connected to the earth and to the sky and to the waters, to the animals and plants, that we all share a bond together. And so we honor everything every morning by saying our prayers and acknowledging, saying our thank yous to everything that is, so that we can maintain ourselves and our families here.
The practice of recognizing connections was stimulated in the city when Native people sought associations with other Indians, often from different nations.
In the old times, we would gather together in the summer to do our gathering and our fishing and our hunting. And then when it came winter, we break up into smaller bands. Well, the same thing happens in the cities. As the different people come into the cities, they find places where they can gather together. And one of the things they do when they gather together is they'll have the potluck dinner or the potlatch.
I think there's a sense of bonding of a lot of the Indian community members that are here, whether they came from the same nation or not. There's a number of us that have grown up together and gone to high school together, got to know one another later on as adults.
The Indian population in Milwaukee never comprised more than 2% of the city's population. At times, this bonding became necessary for survival of the group.
Living in an urban community, tribal centrism does not work, in that we need to keep together as an intertribal entity in order to get funding for Indian urban programs. And a lot of times the government agencies will say, well, what tribe are you with? What tribe are you with? Thinking of government-to-government relationships instead of an intertribal urban Indian relationship. And our tribal centrism sometimes steps in that way, where we'll say, well, we're this tribe or that tribe, when we should actually be saying, well, we're urban Indians, and that's how we need to get more of the funding for our programs, such as Spotted Eagle High School and Indian Council of the Elderly.
In the city, Native people had more contact with individuals from non-Indian ethnic backgrounds. Some experienced the familiar racism they had known in rural areas, and some described more tolerance.
I feel now, where I'm working in the Indian school here, I feel valued. I feel like I have a lot to offer, and by the non-Native teachers as well, I just feel more respected, whereas I didn't feel that way up on the res. I just experienced more racism.
But most discussed common practices they recognized among their own nations and the groups they came to know in Milwaukee. Scholars of ethnic boundaries, such as Frederick Barth, usually document the ways cultural groups look for distinctions between themselves and others. But nearly all the Native people interviewed for the project focused on commonalities rather than differences.
I like the cultural diversity in Milwaukee, the different ethnic groups. There's a number of different American Indians from different nations across the United States and Canada that live in Milwaukee, but I also enjoy the Latino community members, Hmong Lao, African American, and like we have the different festivals, and that's interesting to learn more from the people that are from those cultures.
We honor the four colors, black, yellow, red, and white, and all of these colors come together as a human race. They all have their own ceremonies in their own spiritual ways, but there's always something there that links them together with another one.
I personally believe, you know, that we are all related, and that like some of the biblical stories correspond or correlate really well with Native American stories, because the Native Americans have flood stories, and the Native American have twin stories, twin fighting, brothers, you know, fighting. The same thing in Native stories, traditional oral tradition. There's the same kinds of stories, and so I really believe that, you know, we are all related.
The Native Americans use different herbs to smudge. The African people use different herbs to smudge. The Hispanic people use different herbs.
The Irish and the Indian people are very, very similar in that the Irish have their clan systems, so do we. The Irish built their forts in circular ways, so did we. The Gaelic people had an Earth Mother religion and a female-dominated society. Believe it or not, and our women are pretty strong also. Our language was ripped from us, and so was theirs.
Some of those who noted differences in practices of Milwaukee groups found ways to incorporate those differences into their own lives.
When I was on the reservation, living on the reservation, I had already toured in Europe with a native musician a few times before I came down here to school. And so I was already going on my music career. It's just that it helped me to develop a few other things. Say, like if I was a painter, it gave me some extra colors to work with, as opposed to having maybe 3 or 4. And coming down here, I had like 7 or 8 to work with. And it's also good because I can go back to the reservation, and which I do every summer, and work with kids in music. And I have more to bring back now.
But nearly all the Native people interviewed stressed the value, in fact, the necessity of maintaining their own traditions. Keeping these beliefs and practices over the years often involved personal risks, until the passage of the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act in 1978, many Native practices were outlawed in the United States.
The importance of the Freedom of Religion Act was important to a lot of cultures in the United States, but for the American Indian people it was important for us because we were now allowed to assimilate the traditions and the ceremonies that a lot of people were continuing to do, and we didn't have to do those in hiding any longer. We could now bring those to the forefront and start teaching our children openly about their culture and traditions. It also allowed us to play medicine games in lacrosse, where lacrosse was actually an Ivy League game and could be played in that arena. When American Indian people played lacrosse, we had to do that out in the woods and hide out in the fields, because if they were caught playing lacrosse, we could be arrested because it was a medicine. It was a pagan ritual.
The efforts at de-Indianizing Wisconsin's indigenous people ultimately failed. If anything, cultural practices among Wisconsin's Indian nations have amplified over the years. Much of this revival has occurred in the city.
There's younger children who are learning more about their culture through the schools, through the Native schools in the city. And working with them, I help teach them these things, to teach them about their own culture. And a lot of their parents are excited that their children are getting this opportunity to learn about these things that they never had the chance to when they were children. So they started to learn as they were older, being dislocated from the res. They started to learn things as they were older, and now their children are starting as young children to learn these things.
Native practices, known as Indian life ways, are spiritually centered.
Most people go to church on Sunday, right? Sunday is their day to go to church. Well, for an Indian, every day is Sunday. I mean, we call it life ways. That's how we're supposed to act every day. You know, those things they teach you in church on Sunday, we're supposed to behave that way every day because we don't know how long we're going to be on this earth.
According to some Native groups and individuals, the spiritual center of Indian life ways is incompatible with other religions. Among others, some Indian spiritual practices can blend with those of non-Native religions.
You can be a Christian Indian, that's up to you. But like, I cannot mix Meday and Christianity. It just does not work. So I consider myself not a Christian, even though I have a Christian background. Matter of fact, I have numerous Christians background. I was baptized Catholic and Baptist, raised in a non-denominational church. Heavy into Catholicism because of my grandmother and my own mother. But I found it lacking and finally went back to the Meday one I learned about from a close friend. I learned about the Meday and went back into that. And I find it much more into my belief system. And first time I went, I felt like I was home.
I'm not saying that it's not controversial amongst traditionalists or amongst, conservative people in the church, but it has been a big strength in our community to have a Native church and to have the blending of our culture in these churches. For example, we smudge at church. They, what else do we do? Use tobacco for an offering. At the Catholic Church, Indian church in town, they use tobacco and they go out and pray with that in the middle of the Mass. So in another Lutheran church, they burn the 4 medicines. They use tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar as purification, cleansing, and offering to Gitchimanidu, the Creator.
Native people in Milwaukee today demonstrate their commitment to Indian life ways in all aspects of daily living. Practices range from language preservation to sweat lodges, to ghost dinners, to music, to dancing, to dress, to Indian gaming, to naming ceremonies, to food, to powwows.
The effort that our elders and our tribal peoples are working towards is to encourage our Native people, our Native youth, to bring back our culture, to relearn it, to take the time to teach your children it, so that eventually our culture and our traditions and our language will stay intact.
There has been projected that by the middle of this century, when the elders die off, the fluent elders die off in many tribes, there'll be 5 languages that may survive that, 5 indigenous languages. I know Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Moen is one of them that will survive. And that's because of Canadian speakers, not American speakers, American Indian speakers.
I can pass it down through my family and know what my ancestors been learning past for generations. And, hoping my children will pass it down to theirs and keep on going. Then the language won't die out.
The sweat lodge is different in different tribes. We do sweat in conjunction with healing ceremonies, whippies and stuff like that. But this sweat lodge is a ceremony in and of itself. And for me, I'm Christian and Indian. I'm a Christian Indian. And I remember what Nicodemus asked Christ when Christ said he had to be born again of the water and the Spirit. Can I enter again my mother's womb? Well, I do. Every Sunday I enter my mother's womb and I'm born again of the water and of the Spirit. And it's a place of comfort for me. I've never found a more intense way to pray.
A naming ceremony is a spiritual name that's given to Native people. Usually it's given through a dream from the Creator, from the spirit world, and what it is then, it's a spiritual name that is kind of a spirit helper, and it protects you and it guides you along your way of life. And so it's good to have an Indian name, and they say that when you cross over to the other side of the river that the Creator will call you by your Indian name because that's how you're known from the spirit world. So that name was already, you know, chosen for you in the spirit world. It was just kind of, then you have to have the ceremony to get that name.
The drum, according to elders have told me and mentioned, that was given us to unify our people, the native people. And here in this city, it's a big help with all the other distractions. So it helps bring us together here in the city or wherever we're at. It was said this drum was given to us by Mother Nature, or our Mother Earth, however you might call it.
Well, gambling was a way of life with Indian people all the time, even before Europeans came here. Whole villages would get together, one village with their medicine man, another village with their medicine man, and they would wager sometimes whole villages against whole villages on who was the stronger of the two. So they would do guessing games. Children's games were primarily guessing games and stuff like that. So gambling was a little bit of a way of life.
I've been going to powwows all my life. I have never seen a fight break out on a powwow grounds. It's a place where Indian people gather to sing and dance and get together. There's no alcohol allowed on the grounds. It's a lot different than people that go out on the weekends to different places to gather and have fun and do the same thing, sing and dance. But a lot of times in those kind of places, people end up with fights or whatever. I've been going to powwows all my life. I have never seen a fight break out on a powwow grounds.
They are social events, but they're also events of education purposes as well. You see the different nations. You can tell a lot about people just by the outfits that they're wearing, what their nations are, what their clans are, who their families are, just by looking at the outfits that they wear. And it is an educational process to teach other people about who we are as a different people, instead of everyone just thinking about us as being termed just Indian. We're 500 plus different nations.
And of course, there are the Indian art forms. American indigenous population has a long history of collective action and self-sufficiency. The contributions made by Native people to European Americans, either by coercion or choice, have been widely documented. These include the land we today call the United States, strategies for plant cultivation, the mainstays in the American diet, healing herbs, and the wilderness trails. What is not widely known is how much the indigenous Americans contributed to what would later become identified with European American ideals. For example, few people probably know the extent to which the authors of the United States Constitution borrowed major tenets from the Great Law of Peace developed by the Iroquois Confederacy. Today, representative democracy in the United States is a model for collective action. Scholars of early American history also point out the ways that immigrating Europeans emulated Indian dress, hairstyles, hunting strategies, music, and the strong, reserved personalities of the indigenous population to develop the collective idea of the American cowboy. More recently, many ecology activists in the United States have adopted the Indian model of safeguarding the connections in the natural environment.
Our role, our responsibilities to this world actually were to support that chain that scientists talk about, that food chain. And in fact, it's the stars and the sun and creation that comes before us, the earth and the water. We have responsibilities to that, the insects and the plants, the animals. All those things come before us, because without any of those levels, we don't exist anymore. And we need to be caretakers of them. We don't own them. As a matter of fact, we belong to them.
The emulation of Indian ways has both an upside and a downside.
It's called the Mascutin Society, and this one is out of Illinois. It's a hobbyist group, and there's a number of hobbyist groups in the country, but this one is a particularly respectful one. They do everything in a sort of dignified, decent way. There are children, and the members of the group usually volunteer their time around the country at Pine Ridge or doing home repairs, various things. So it's not just that they bring in the culture, they also try to give back a little to the communities that they invite to their powwows.
There's a lot of charlatans out there, and not just non-native charlatans. You know, somebody's gone to a ceremony once or twice and all of a sudden they're leading this ceremony and they're charging for it. And non-natives come, they don't know any different. You know, a spiritual leader, a true spiritual leader does not charge for a ceremony.
The practices associated with harmony and collective action, long linked with Indian life ways and emulated by others, would become most important to the native people in adapting to life in cities. When Indians migrated to urban areas, they found few resources and had too few numbers to pressure political gatekeepers to expand these resources. They relied on their collective traditions. In Milwaukee, they strengthened their networks and developed organization after organization.
Well, when I came here in 1947, the only organizations they had here was the Consolidated Tribes of North America and the Chippewa Club. There was nothing else, just those two groups. But now I got all kinds of different organizations.
So you first come off and you feel afraid and alone because you're native and there's not all these other Menominees around you or Indian people around you. But then there's that link there, and from the instant I went into the Indian office at the UWM, I instantly felt safe, I guess, like because you're not at home, but there's people there who are like you and you're not alone. So they welcome you, they help you, they take you around, you meet people, and it becomes like your family away from home.
The urban Indians developed their own spiritual centers and found ways to incorporate their practices into Christian churches.
The role of Saginaw Center, we actually have 4 areas: social justice, human concerns, language and culture, and spirituality. We're kind of like a locus for the native churches here in Milwaukee, and we do bring in traditional spiritual leaders also to come and work with us.
Native people built a rich inventory of health programs.
We've had organizations, for example, like the Indian Healthcare Clinic in Milwaukee. It's had several names throughout various years over the last 30 years, but it still exists. And through the efforts of Indian people who got it going and keep it going and provide a service that does allow people to come and get healthcare services, for example, that are unique to their particular kinds of circumstances.
They developed 2 major schools in Milwaukee serving hundreds of Native children: the Indian Community School, serving K4 through 8 students, and the Spotted Eagle High School. The urban Indians also developed educational outreach programs in other schools.
The other thing too is that in the Milwaukee Public Schools there are concentrations of American Indian students, and now we're trying to address the needs of those children more specifically through some in-service training. And that's something that we're trying to move forward and be a little more proactive at. And then too, I think the American Indian Studies program at UWM has helped with that by bringing other people together.
They drew on their traditions and added leisure time activities.
But I know our student group is very active in trying to do events or do things together, and as part of that, they've done things like had beading sessions where we get together at a person's house and make something. Here at our office, we offered how to make shawls. whatever we know or whatever, and we can pass on, like how to make a dream catcher or whatever. If students are interested in that, then we try to offer that to them. Getting together in those small groups is also social, and that's a cultural thing as well. And then having food or whatever are things that we always try to include in the things that we do.
They found ways to fund their own organizations through casinos. They created their own programs to assist Indian businesses, such as loan funds.
Our intent is to be the lender and prepare these businesses for the next level by being their lender for a short period of time. The program is designed to provide access to capital to business owners, people that are starting their own business or expanding their business in Wisconsin. This is the first program in the country that is going to serve Native entrepreneurs on a statewide basis.
Native people developed social services.
Sustaining those same people who are strong leaders have gone out and gotten other sources of assistance that are available to the mainstream, but speak to the same kinds of pathologies that Indian people really meet in large numbers, whether or not it's diabetes, or whether or not it is an alcohol or drug abuse issue, or single parenting. There have been tremendous efforts made by strong Indian leaders in this community, and I know that that's true also in other urban Indian communities.
And most significantly, more Indian activism movements grew out of urban linkages than had developed in the rural settlements. Some of the activism addressed specific urban issues. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded in the Twin Cities to deal with law enforcement agencies, and chapters then spread to other cities. In 1971, the Milwaukee chapter of AIM occupied a vacant Coast Guard station on Lake Michigan and gradually turned it over to the growing Indian Community School. Other urban movements developed to address mascot issues or the legal definition of minority status.
There was a movement to get rid of the Marquette Warrior, a mascot that was looked at as pretty degrading by a lot of Native folks. And they pursued that, and Marquette University listened to those concerns, modified their approach to the Marquette Warrior, and tried to do something different by having American Indians represent themselves. And on the heels of that effort, Marquette University eventually joined with other schools in the state of Wisconsin and changed their name because they found that it was degrading.
Even movements to effect change on or near rural settlements were founded in cities. The successful initiative to return the Menominee to its tribal status, called DRUMS, or the determination of rights and unity for Menominee shareholders, developed in Milwaukee and Chicago in the 1970s. Marches to protect the environment near reservations began in Milwaukee.
We could start with the Menominee termination. There was an organization that was formed after that happened called DRUMS. And that was basically not only Menominee people, but people of all different tribes coming together. They would hold meetings in the city, and then they would go up to Kashina and Neobit, and they would protest, trying to get that termination turned over or removed.
It was just a couple of people meeting, talking about how can we do something about this. You know, we can write letters and things, but then there was somebody who wanted to walk, an individual, Dewey Shenandoah, wanted to walk and hold a walk against the Crandon mine in favor of the Wolf River, to help save the river, make awareness, make consciousness to the outside people of what was happening with the Wolf River. So me and my husband became very involved with that, and we helped organize this walk and coordinate the walk. And it was 320 miles, I believe, from the White Buffalo in Janesville, Wisconsin, up to the Crandon mine site in Crandon. So it was several weeks long, and it just made us feel like it was something that we can contribute to help.
When all of this is put together, The networks, the emulated practices, wealth of organizations, and the activism, it means added value to the city of Milwaukee. Native people have contributed culturally rich institutions to the city.
The Indian community was asked to help the Milwaukee Public Museum develop the Tribute to Survival exhibit that's currently, I think it's on the second floor of the museum. Indian Summer Festivals, that's a group of American Indian people that came together to have a more positive representation of American Indian people and the accomplishments of the different peoples of the Americas.
The urban Indians have built successful businesses all over southeast Wisconsin.
First on the list is a guy by the name of Brian Holmes. Brian is the partner in two companies, Ojibwa Ready Mix and B&D Contractors. B&D Contractors installed all the seating in the new Miller Park Brewer Stadium. They also did rough carpentry work down at the Museum Edition downtown. Other examples of Indian-owned businesses in Milwaukee is Underground Pipeline, Inc. That's a New Berlin company owned by the Dretzka brothers. Also Howard Kingman, owner of Kingman Custom Contractors out in Oconomowoc. They do major remodels, new home building, and other construction projects for residences. And Great Lakes Contracting is a company down on the south side of Milwaukee. They do structural steel work.
Native people have contributed professionals to domains such as education, healthcare, the legal system, and human services.
We have doctors, we have nurses, we have technicians, so that presents a more positive front and a contemporary image of American Indian people versus a stereotypical image of American Indian people. We have architects too. We have several professors that work not only in American Indian Studies at UW Milwaukee, but also in like the English department, social work, and things like that. So we're in the community making contributions both as individuals and as American Indian people.
Native people have built programs to serve the wider community.
This at one time was a very dangerous gang area. The Latin Kings and the Cobras were supposedly battling for this turf. And when I had heard that, I had no idea what they meant about battling for a turf. And then I started thinking, well, that must be some gunfire or something. And I'm not about that. And after about a week later, I called the guy up and I told him, I said, well, we will open up the program because it is a good program it gives the kids something to do besides roaming the streets and hanging out.
In addition, successfully run efforts such as the Potawatomi Casino contribute a vast inventory of resources to the wider community, both in terms of employment opportunities and in terms of direct grants to non-Indian organizations.
With the foundation, we are outreaching as best as we can to help eliminate poverty. In addition to the foundation giving money to charitable organizations, we also employ over 1,600 people in Milwaukee. Many of these people were W-2 recipients and were having a very hard time supporting their family. With the jobs they have been able to obtain through Potawatomi Bingo Casino, they are now enjoying not only a good wage, but also benefits.
The indigenous Wisconsin population, once removed from the area now known as Milwaukee, returned to the city by both coercion and choice. Lacking resources and political power, they drew on their own cultural practices to build new organizations, strategize to preserve their life ways, create linkages to other groups, lead causes, and support their own needs. While caring for their own community, they contributed cultural institutions, valuable enterprises, and funding streams into the wider Milwaukee community. The Native people accomplished this through the kind of collective action they drew from Indian-like ways.